You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at soxinthebasement.com. So I had completed the entire episode of Sox in the Basement. I sat back and watched the Dodgers-Yankees. I enjoyed the fact the Yankees gave a little bit of fight. I even enjoyed the two fans that ripped the ball out of Mookie Betts' glove. I'm not saying they were right. I'm not saying they weren't fools, but I do enjoy some tomfoolery in the World Series. They got what they deserved. They got thrown out of the game, and the guy's a season ticket holder, so he probably lost his Yankees tickets forever. Series is 3-1. I bet you the Yankees win the next one and it goes back to LA. Dodgers are going to win it though. Michael Kopech killing it. All he had to do was become a relief pitcher. We said that for years on this show. Good for him. It's awesome. But the first part of this episode of Sox in the Basement discussed that series. Talked about Kopech, where he is, and talked about all the possible managerial hires. And then Will Venable got hired. Scott Merkin, first on it. Good friend of the show, been on Sox in the Basement multiple times. Late on Tuesday night, the White Sox hired their 44th manager in franchise history on Will Venable's birthday. Happy birthday to him. It is not official via the White Sox, but we're seeing multiple beat reporters, national as well, backing up Merk's sources. And it seems like the White Sox got their guy. Or actually, it seems like Chris Getz got his guy. Because it was my belief all along that even though you saw all these names changing when lists were coming out, Venable and Phil Nevin were always on the list over the last week or so. Nevin felt like Tony La Russa's guy. Venable seemed like the guy that Chris Getz would want. This is a guy who turned down the Mets for an interview last year. This is a guy that the Marlins were also chasing. In fact, he was one of their final two candidates. Did Chris Getz just fend off Tony La Russa's influence and outbid the Marlins for the hottest managerial name out there on the market? The heir apparent to Bruce Bochy with the Rangers. A guy who was a special assistant to Theo Epstein during the 2018 and 2019 seasons for the Cubs, third base coach in 2020, Red Sox bench coach in 21 and 22, and multiple teams across Major League Baseball were gunning for him, and he takes this job. That's crazy. Like, I believe that he's going to get his pick of his staff. I believe it's going to be a really good deal for him because this is only one of many deals that seem to have been available to Will Venable over the last couple of years. We'll see, but I mean, like, that's my take on it. This guy had all the power. He didn't need to take this job in particular. He could have sat around with Texas. He could have interviewed with the Mets last year. He could have taken the Marlins job. For some reason, he wants to manage a team coming off the worst season in Major League Baseball history, modern baseball history. I mean, I guess you don't have any pressure when you take that job, right? Like, he could improve this team by 20 wins. They could still have over 100 losses, and he would look like a genius. I truly believe that the hiring of Venable tells you that Chris Getz is in control. He had that meeting. He convinced Jerry that he needed to restructure internally. You see the entire international scouting department upended, revamped. Guys are getting fired left and right. Chris Getz is clearing the decks, and then he gets a manager that seems like had to be his pick. Rick Hahn didn't get his pick, but Getz did.
Well, and to be fair as well, we are supposing, because Will Venable, to be fair, is a hot name and a guy that turned down the Mets job and a guy that has been wanted and the Rangers have been approached about him by pretty much anybody who has an opening, that he is the guy that Chris Getz is chasing because that seems like a Chris Getz hire. For all we know, that could be Tony La Russa sitting there going, well, if this guy's suckling at the teat of Bruce Bochy is a guy that I know, go and get Venable. And it could very well be that Chris Getz is looking at it going, you know what, I like what Phil Nevin did with the Angels when he was handed a no-win scenario and still managed to squeeze some juice out of that lifeless bunch too.
Phil Nevin's an upgrade. That's the thing. But I think you look at the Venable thing and you say, this is the most highly sought-after managerial candidate of the last year or so across Major League Baseball.
Venable is, if I'm not mistaken, Venable's the assistant manager, right?
He was the heir apparent to Bruce Bochy.
He may already be basically managing the Rangers with Bruce Bochy sitting there giving him some pointers and tips and holding the manager title. I mean, we don't know the dynamic. You and I don't think are privy enough to know the dynamic between Will Venable and Bruce Bochy right now. But the Rangers is a franchise that has a lot of, they're just in a lot better position. They have invested in that team. They have talent there. They will compete again in the NL West next year. I'm not making predictions that they're going to win anything, but they are a competitive franchise. They're a franchise that has turned themselves around. And so Venable may be looking at that going, I'm comfortable here. I like it here. I know these guys. I know this organization. I know the ownership. I don't really want to leave unless somebody makes me the offer I can't refuse. Unless somebody goes full Godfather on me and puts a horse head in my bed, I'm not leaving the Rangers.
And maybe that's what Chris Getz did, because I was starting to think that it was going to be Phil Nevin. It was not Phil Nevin. It was Will Venable, the 44th manager in the history of the Chicago White Sox, and long may he reign. The longer he sticks around means he's doing a good job. We're improving. We're getting better. Let's look at the offseason now. We're going to get into that on this episode. Senator Bill Cunningham, state senator. Also, we have clips from him talking about the 78 project, the farce that is Jerry Reinsdorf acting like he's going to leave. And I think the next thing we're all going to watch over the next day or so, Sox will confirm this, and we're going to find out what the staff is going to look like. Again, I just can't imagine a guy with the options that Venable had blindly having to take staff, coaches that he didn't want on the team. He could have stayed put in Texas and kept guys around that he liked. He could have gone to Miami. He could have interviewed with the Mets. You know the White Sox want to keep Grady Sizemore around. You know that. Does he end up on his staff? Does Venable want him there? Maybe Grady becomes a minor league manager. I don't know. Chris Getz has to avoid doing the same thing with Grady Sizemore or another member of that staff that Kenny Williams did with Darryl Boston. Keeping his friend, keeping somebody he wanted around in that locker room who's reporting back as to what's going on. I want my manager to be able to pick every single person on his staff and then be in charge of them, and they know that they report directly to him. We keep hearing about new structure, people knowing who they report to now, the analytics department being renamed, new scouts, all this stuff. Everything's being structured a little bit differently in the front office. Don't stop at how it works with your manager. Make sure the manager talks to the GM and everybody else runs through the manager, and let him decide who's going to be in there with him. I know I'm asking for you to do something that's against the White Sox way, but outbidding the Marlins for a hot managerial name and not going with a tried and true old guy that would have made it feel like the Tony La Russa hire, that would have made it feel like Tony La Russa had something to do with it, that's also not the White Sox way. So there's hope, and that's what we're going to be looking at this week. Sox in the Basement listeners, switch to a new age of life with Hyatt Home Medical Equipment. Keep mom and dad, grandma and grandpa out of assisted living. Make it so they can get around on their own and live independently with stair lifts, ramps, grab bars, lift chairs, and even bathroom remodeling. They're going to work with your insurance. They have 0% financing for qualified individuals. If you use a CPAP machine and you're unhappy with your vendor, switch now, get supplies directly mailed to you. And Hyatt Home Medical Equipment has the latest and greatest in continuous glucose monitors. See everything that Hyatt has to offer at HHME.com. So I do want to get into the roster and things that might happen after the manager is finally selected. And I think that's coming here in the next couple of days. But what I want to get into first is this clip that I want to play for you. Now, I have a bunch of different podcasts that I do, and it's a rarity when it happens, but sometimes I'm talking to somebody about something completely different, and something ends up on microphone that I'm like, oh, wow, I really got to play that on the other show. So I do a local show for Evergreen Park. I've been doing it for 6 years. for the village, and it just covers everything that happens in the village. It's a great communication tool for all the different entities in the village. I mean, we just had both superintendents and like other people from their school boards for both school boards that are in Evergreen Park on to talk about property taxes and the tax hikes that have happened in the area and where it goes with the schools and things like that. And then I had State Senator Bill Cunningham on the most recent episode, and he was talking about one of the biggest issues in the state of Illinois is that your schools are funded with property taxes, and they're not funded the same way as most other states. There's an issue. So it becomes very difficult to spend money on things other than the schools because there's not enough getting to the schools when you take out the state funding. And it prompted me to say, so it wouldn't make sense to give $2 billion to a billionaire to build a stadium when he doesn't really need it. And then this is the conversation that took place next about Jerry Reinsdorf and the 78. So the question is whether or not we can find a better way to fund education, which, it's funny. We're sitting here on the EP podcast, and one of my other shows you might know is Sox in the Basement, which is one of the top White Sox podcasts.
And that's the one I would like to be on.
Oh, yeah, you can come on. We could talk about that. We could talk about how ludicrous it would be to give a billionaire multi-billions of dollars to get a new stadium when he's already got one that is perfectly fine.
Yep.
And I would rather see those billions address the problem you're talking about. And it seems as though the state and the city and all these other people, all the other politicians in the area, no matter what level they're at, have basically given him the same response, right? Because there are bigger things to look at here if you're going to spend that kind of money.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think people's view of tax subsidies for stadiums is in a completely different place than when it was in 1988 when the White Sox got funding to build new Comiskey Park, or even in 2001 when the legislature passed a bill to help the Bears renovate Soldier Field. There's just not a willingness to do this anymore. I think Governor Pritzker has a good response to this. And when he says essentially what you just said, I'm not comfortable with state tax dollars going to subsidize billionaires who own professional sports franchises. He often adds the caveat that, we in the state and local governments do this too. We often provide tax incentives or infrastructure upgrades. If you're going to build a shopping mall, no one's building shopping malls anymore, right. but if you did, the state will pay to reconfigure the intersection and put up red lights to make it easier for people to get in and out of that shopping mall, because there's a public benefit to that, because tax dollars are being collected in the shopping mall. So we can always do those kind of things. And I think we can do that too for a new stadium.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Think about what he did in that area that he's in right now, right? He's been there for like 30 years or so, right? And he's got big giant parking lots around it. And so do you really think local businesses are benefiting from his team? I know that the businesses I know down there that I do business with all took a huge hit this year because he didn't field a good team. So it's a great idea. Hey, if you give me this $2 billion, I'm going to revitalize the neighborhood. He's killing the neighborhood right now. That's the thing. He's actually something bad for it currently.
Well, and that gets to what a horribly disappointing design that ballpark was.
Yeah.
A concrete donut in the middle of a bunch of parking lots. The last of that kind of stadium built anywhere in the country. Since then, stadiums have been built and they try to integrate in the neighborhood around them and be part of the neighborhood around them. And there's value to doing that that generates more tax dollars. The White Sox did not do that when they built new Comiskey Park. They did that intentionally. It was a horrible mistake. And now you see Jerry Reinsdorf and others saying, well, no, we want to go closer to downtown and build a Camden Yards style park, which they could have done in the late 80s, early 90s, and chose not to.
You could take one of those parking lots and turn it into a little village and all that. There's a lot you could do.
You could, and people have made proposals like that. And actually, those parking lots are owned by the state.
Okay.
The Illinois Sports Facilities Authority owns those lots. So that can be done. And there are people at the ISFA who are looking at those things. Now, the contract with the White Sox is such as that there has to be agreement. But the rent between the ISFA and the White Sox, the rental agreement, the lease, I should say, is up after the 2029 season. If the White Sox do stay there, I think that's something that should come into play. We should look at redeveloping those parking lots. We should look at integrating the neighborhood. One of the things that drives me crazy, and you hear this a lot from North Siders and North Suburbanites, but Rob Manfred, the commissioner of baseball, said this today. Like, there's problems with that neighborhood.
There's nothing wrong with that neighborhood.
Bridge Park is a great neighborhood.
It's a great neighborhood. That was the most ridiculous statement I've ever heard.
It could be better if you found a way to do a better job of integrating the ballpark into the surroundings. Something they did not try to do. In fact, they tried to do the exact opposite. They built a cocoon to wall the ballpark off from the neighborhood. That's something I think we should think about doing. And it's something that, like I said, that's state-owned property. The state owns the stadium. The state owns the parking lot. They have an agreement with the White Sox that gives them a lot of veto power over what goes there. But I think we should look at this 2029 end of that lease as an opportunity to make some changes there and improve the ballpark and improve the ballpark experience.
It feels like
they're still going to be playing there.
It feels like something a new ownership group, which I think that's a bunch of bull, but I think a new ownership group, if you were to sell or if somebody eventually would end up buying it, should know that there is that ability to go and do those things with that stadium. They don't need to leave.
And the White Sox recognize that now. One of the reasons they want to go to the 78 is to be integrated in that community and to have bars and restaurants and a whole neighborhood effect.
Right.
They blew that last time. I think they can fix it if they wanted to and they work properly with the state on it, they could. But all these owners now, they want an experience. They want the ballpark with bars and restaurants all around. It's, not as organic as, say, it is at Wrigley Field, but other franchises have done this and have done it successfully, and we should do that here, whether it's in a new park or a reimagination of the existing park.
The thing that sticks out to me the most is the thing that I didn't fully understand until the senator brought it up, and he's going to be back on the show at some point because he's a huge White Sox fan. We laughed afterwards about how we could have turned that into a half hour just talking about Reinsdorf and what he's done with different committees, and what he's learned about stadium deals. I mean, there's a lot there. And he lives right here nearby. So he's going to come back down and have a beer at the bar one day, and we're going to really get into it. But the thing that I didn't fully understand was the state's relationship to the parking lots. Like, it's a sweetheart deal what Reinsdorf has, and you have to think about this. I mean, connect the dots on this. Every owner, as the senator said, wants the kind of thing that these newer stadium deals have, which is a pop-up neighborhood, something that's got attractions around the ballpark, and they make it a full experience. Everybody wants that. It's not what Jerry Reinsdorf wanted. It's a blunder by the White Sox to set up their stadium the way that they did when they had other options. It was short-sighted. And now, decades later, Reinsdorf wants what everybody else has, but he's the one that made the deal. And it sounds like the state is essentially saying, whoa, hold on a second, buddy. You signed this. This is what you wanted. You wanted the sweetheart deal. You wanted us to run the parking lots. You wanted us to be involved in these ways so that you were protected financially. If you don't end up getting enough attendance, you actually get a little bit of money back. You wanted us to basically build you a stadium that you didn't have to throw any money into. But then this is the side effect of that. And it reminds me, what's been really funny to me, Ed, since I've listened to that. Remember when Reinsdorf used to sit there and say, I didn't sign Scottie Pippen's deal? Remember when Pippen's always been mad about the Bulls? And like how, and Reinsdorf's like, well, he shouldn't have signed the deal. Guess what, Jerry? You took a deal, you were short-sighted, and now it looks like you're getting told you shouldn't have signed the deal. It's almost poetic justice the way that I'm hearing that.
100% poetic justice. And this is one of the things that I think we have started to realize about Jerry Reinsdorf as an owner and a business person is that there is a level of short-sightedness within him that has become apparent in a few ways. One of them was the stadium itself. Remember, that stadium was built. It was very much a kind of a throwback to more of the cookie-cutter stadiums that had been around the majors, built in the 60s and 70s, and were not reflective of, what was to come. Camden Yards opens about a year later, and is this sort of glorious, beautiful kind of throwback to the golden days of baseball.
And it's a known thing that Jacobs Field at the time and Camden Yards, which were both built at around the same time, the same architecture firm admitted in interviews that they showed those plans to the White Sox and they didn't want those stadiums.
No, and instead what you ended up with was the gray and powder blue and the metal trusses and all that stuff. That's just really, it's not a bad ballpark by any stretch of the imagination, but it lacks some of the character that you see now around the majors. And what you look at with that is, oh gosh, how short-sighted was that? And not owning the land, not owning the dirt upon which your building is built is something that I would think a guy who made money in real estate would really understand, like, this is how it is. But I bet you Jerry wanted flexibility back then. I bet you what he wanted was he wanted just a lease or a contract that he could turn over and get out of if he needed to in the event of a sale, in the event that he wanted to get out of the White Sox. He's never done it, okay? And now that the lease is running up and he's looking at it, you're right, he's regretting not owning the dirt, which is the other reason why the whole thing with the 78 and the state owning it again doesn't make sense to me, because all you have to look is at the Bears and what they're doing, because they're in a similar situation. They've been leasing Soldier Field since time immemorial from, they don't own it, right? We know this. And that's why they went and bought Arlington Park and tore it down, because at least they own a piece of land that if Virginia McCaskey passes away and the family, the estate, decides that they're going to sell the Bears for however many billions that the Bears are worth now, they have a piece of property that a new ownership group can sit there and go, well, we can either sell it and leverage it to find something else, or we can move to Arlington Heights and figure that out if the whole tax thing happens. Jerry is still sitting there wanting a monument to himself. He wants a new stadium, but he's still trying to get somebody else to buy it for him. And this is where, from a business standpoint, you sit there and you go, okay, it makes sense. Why doesn't he spend money on the field? Well, it's a short-sighted thing when you're not going to give long-term contracts to good players and you're not going to keep up with what the major leagues do in terms of how they handle free agency and how they handle re-signing their own players. It's a short-sighted thing. If you're not going to own your land, it's a short-sighted thing because you can't develop it. All right. The Ricketts family, what was the first thing the Ricketts family did across town? When they got to Wrigley Field, they turned around and started scooping up all the land around it. That's not land that they're leasing from anybody. Jerry, go buy the 78 and then put up a dang stadium if that's what you want to do, right? And build that up if that's what you want to do. You've got the funds, you've got the money, you don't need my tax dollars to go to this. And if you do it and you do it right, I will show up. And I know a lot of people will. It's never been a question of White Sox fans not wanting to be at the ballpark. I think at this point, it's just sitting there going, we hear stuff like this, okay? We hear from a state senator. We hear from, other business people. We hear from The Athletic. You just hear over and over and over again how you've got somebody sitting up there making these decisions and none of them make a lick of sense, and all of them come back to who is going to get me out of my own mess.
Sox in the Basement listeners trying to make the most of your money, give a call to Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor. Located on the corner of 111th and Kedzie, but serving the Chicagoland area, Tom has a get-to-know-you approach and a do-the-right-thing attitude. He's been doing this for decades. It's all about knowing your options when you're investing and planning for your retirement. No matter what stage you are at, it costs nothing to check in with Tom. Give Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor, a call today, 773-779-0023. Edward Jones, member SIPC. Let's talk real quick before we get out of here about trades, because I'm starting to see fans do what they do when it comes to it. Everybody's doing it. The radio stations are starting to throw it out there. Podcasts are throwing it out there. Bloggers are throwing it out there.
It's that time of year.
It's that time of year where people use the trade simulators and they start saying, well, what if we traded this guy and got this guy? And I always try to avoid it on this show because to pull off a trade, the team that's making the trade has to evaluate the players in a similar way as the trade partner. They have to be willing to make the trade. It lines up on paper, but we don't know how these teams and how these front offices really value these players. So it's so hard to predict specific deals. It's fun to do, but it's hard to predict. And as I look at all the little proposals I'll see on social media or something that I'll read in a publication or hear, I think to myself, I'm not concerned about who gets dealt and what you get back for them, like the actual names. I just want to see smart moves that change my baseball team for the better. Like, I'm okay with anybody on this roster being dealt. I remember last year, actually, especially in the first part of the season, don't trade Crochet, don't trade Luis Robert Jr. But you could probably convince me that it was a good move to move on from them or anybody else on this team if the return makes sense. And that's all I'm looking for in the offseason. The biggest problem I will have with this offseason is if it isn't a roller coaster of guys moving off of this team because they're changing something. Like if they offer everybody arbitration or pretty much everybody arbitration, if they hold their cards and hold their team pretty much intact and try to convince me that better coaching will all of a sudden make this team better and make these players better, that's where I become angry. I instead would rather see suddenly a name get moved off of this team that makes me a little uncomfortable if I can look at the return and say, this might work, or it at least shows me they're trying to change something. Like if they move Noah Schultz, who's a big prospect right now, if you can justify the return and what it's bringing back is a piece that we need, and we're deep at pitching right now in young pitching, I can accept it. If you move Garrett Crochet and you bring back a couple of pieces that are going to be just staples in your lineup for the next 5 to 10 years, and there's a reasonable expectation of that, then I would trade him. And he's worth that. If Dylan Cease was worth what he was worth, if you see what players are being traded for in the return for them, that's what he's worth. Getz has to be able to hold out for the right return, not the garbage that was that trade with the Cardinals and the Dodgers midseason and getting, I mean, you got garbage back in that unless somebody proves me otherwise, okay? Miguel Vargas, I didn't like it the moment it happened. I still don't like it. I know they're probably going to play him next year and they're going to try to see what they have, but I just don't think you got anything out of that deal and you failed at that trade. You have to make moves that make me feel like you're changing for the better, and I don't care what name that you move on from. I honestly don't. The worst thing that could happen to me in the offseason as a fan is little to no movement, bringing back basically the same team, or watching a return come back that makes no sense. And that I can accept anything else. Trust me, you're going to be able to convince me in the offseason, we traded Luis Robert Jr. and we got these players back. And I'll have James Fox on and he'll be sitting there trying to tell me like this guy's going to be good and don't worry about this guy. And it makes sense from this way. And I'll take the leap of faith. I would rather do that than see nothing happen. Right? I think that's how I'm looking at trade season this offseason.
Well, yeah, and that's the important part of it is, one, it's got to be a trade that makes sense and moves the needle. Like, I would hate to see Garrett Crochet traded for a bunch of guys at the A or high A level where it's going to be a few years and you're doing that. That would bother me. Yeah, that would bother me because just at that level, you just don't know. Okay. But if you trade him even for prospects who are at the AA and ready to make the jump, or AAA and ready to make the jump level, that I think could be justifiable. And I think it's something that you could look at and sit there and go, you know what, this is an attempt to make this team better by taking care of a few glaring needs in one fell swoop. But yeah, the idea that Phil Nevin or Will Venable, getting back to the idea of them being a miracle worker, and taking this roster or some similar version of what the roster will end up being with no real additions, no subtractions from a bunch of guys that got nothing done last year. I mean, nothing done last year. There's talent on the team, but it didn't do anything cohesive to win ball games. I don't care who the manager is. There needs to be subtractions off this team, and there needs to be additions of Major League Baseball players. And then you can start telling me about culture change and stuff like that, because we will see on the field what happens. And also, the last thing I'll say about it is I really don't care who goes away, and I don't care how good they do at their next stop. If you move on from Andrew Vaughn and he goes on to have an all-star season somewhere, just like Michael Kopech, good for him, it wasn't going to happen here.
Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement.
Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always on soxinthebasement.com.